Our talk tonight is called Science and Christianity, Understanding the Nature of the Conflict. So we're going to be tackling some pretty heavy topics tonight, and there's no way to cover all this material in just about 45 or 50 minutes. So we're just scratching the surface, and if you want more resources, then please contact us. So we're going to be talking tonight about a few different topics. First of all, our science and Christianity in conflict. What's the true source of the conflict? Understanding the evolution debate, and why should we even care about this, and how can we respond? So first off, and for those of you who want to ask questions, I forgot to say this, you can ask questions in the chat feature on YouTube. And also it would be helpful if you would go ahead and subscribe and just click on that button. It will make it a little bit easier for you to chat and engage in the conversation. We're not going to be able to address a lot of questions tonight, but what I'm going to do is write down the questions, keep them, and address them in a future class. So let's dig in here. So our science and Christianity in conflict. So there is a pervasive view in our culture that science and Christianity are at war, so to speak. So you can't be both a scientist and a Christian. You have to choose one or the other. And I think if I were to take a poll right now, if we had a live audience, and I polled you and I asked, does it seem like there's a conflict between science and Christianity in our culture, that most of you would probably say yes. There's that feeling in our culture a lot of times, whether it's in schools and universities and the media, there seems to be this tension. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. I grew up in a very loving home. But my dad was very anti-organized religion, and my mom, after my parents got divorced, got involved in a New Age cult. So I lived in a cult when I was in kindergarten. It was quite a long story, but I ended up growing up really loving school, loving academics, because it was so stable. It was so predictable. And I loved that about school. And so I really poured myself into school from a young age. And so I really had this sense that as I grew up and became, more and more academic, that I had to choose. Of course, I'm in the science camp. That's just who I am. I really loved science, and I became more involved as I progressed in my schooling. And so I felt there's this chasm, one side Christians, one side scientists. And I really believed this through my teen years and on into college. And then I had this funny thing happen to me when I was in college. I had a roommate who took me to something called a Veritas Forum. I was a student at University of Michigan, and I was an engineering major and really loved science. And so she thought I would enjoy a couple of these talks. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but they were science and Christianity talks. And so I didn't realize that this was a talk that was geared towards people who were skeptics. And so my friend dragged me to this talk. And for those who aren't familiar with Veritas Forums, I think they were started on Harvard's campus, and they typically bring in professors in different fields, and they'll give talks about different subjects, and they're Christians who are talking about their fields and being a Christian and integration of vocation and faith. And so I remember going to this talk at University of Michigan, and I almost didn't go, and then finally she kind of dragged me there, and there was a chemistry professor there, and his name was Dr. Fritz Schaefer, and he showed a list of famous scientists who were Christians. And he went on to say why he thought it was perfectly reasonable to be a Christian and also to be a scientist. I certainly did not have a conversion overnight. I was very skeptical, especially after growing up with such an interesting religious background, with having a dad who was very anti-organized religion and a mom who was into the New Age. I was very skeptical of anything that was had anything to do with spirituality or faith. And so I definitely did not have any kind of overnight conversion, but I did start asking questions. It was very eye-opening for me to hear him speak. And so I started going to church, and I started doing a Bible study, and I started, asking questions, but I was very apprehensive about these different issues of faith and Christianity and the Bible, and I was very very hesitant. But I did graduate from University of Michigan, and I went on to study at Oxford afterwards with a fellowship. And I walked onto Oxford's campus thinking, all these questions about spirituality and Christianity and all these things, I'm just going to put those on the back burner, because I just want to study abroad and have fun and enjoy myself. And the first day that I was on Oxford's campus, I saw these posters everywhere on campus. They must have just spent hours flyering this campus, and they were all flyers about this big Christian outreach that the Campus Christian Group was doing. And sure enough, half the flyers I saw were science and Christianity, or all of these, can you trust the Bible? All these questions that I had been wrestling with when I was in college, questions that I was asking. And so I met some Christians there on Oxford's campus. I went to some of these talks. I had a lot of my questions answered, and I went on to become a Christian. So I really realized at that time in my life that I didn't have to choose science over Christianity, that you can definitely do both. You can be a scientist and you can be a Christian. And I think that's why this topic is so interesting to me, is I do think that this myth that you can't be a scientist and a Christian really holds a lot of people back from seeking. And so I think it's an important topic to tackle. So let's look at this question: are science and Christianity in conflict? I want to read this quote for you because I think it gives you a feel of why this topic is really important. It's from the book You Lost Me by David Kinnaman. And he's written several books about people leaving the faith and wrestling with different areas. So it says, I was in 10th grade. I started learning about evolution. It felt like my first window into the real world. To be honest, I think that learning about science was a straw that broke the camel's back. I knew from church I couldn't believe in both science and God. So that was it. I didn't believe in God anymore. And again, here's this chasm, on the one hand, Christianity, on the other hand, science. I'm having to choose and having to wrestle with that, with the student, in this case, feeling their upbringing in church made them feel like they couldn't do science as a Christian. So it can really come from both angles, both from the culture and from within church. And I think that's really, really sad, and we need to address that. So let's look at the definition of science. I'm not sure if you could, hopefully you can read some of these slides in the background.
Yeah.
So what is the definition of science? So science is knowledge or a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through the scientific method. So what's the scientific method? The scientific method can be defined as principles and procedures for the systematic pursuit of knowledge involving the recognition and formulation of a problem, collection of data through observation and experiment, and the formulation and testing of hypotheses. So these are just very superficial general definitions. People spend entire semesters in college digging into the definition of science and all of these things. But this is just a basic definition for the purpose of this talk. So now let's look at the definition of Christianity. So Christianity is the religion derived from Jesus Christ, based on the Bible as sacred scripture. So let's ask, do we have a conflict? What do you think? Do we have a conflict here? Can one who believes in the teachings of Jesus Christ as presented in sacred scripture also do the following: pursue knowledge, recognize problems, formulate a hypothesis, perform experiments, collect data. So, of course, Christians can do all of the following. I personally have spent many of my years in a white lab coat, making hypotheses, testing them, and doing experiments, analyzing data. Too many hours doing that in grad school. I went on to get a Ph.D. at Stanford in environmental microbiology. And so I spent many, many years in a lab growing bacteria and doing DNA microarrays and doing this molecular biology type of research, trying to figure out what enzymes are involved in chromium reduction and different things that dealt with that topic. And that was for my thesis. And all the while that I did that, I believed in the teachings of Jesus as presented in the Bible. There was no conflict there for me. And I have many friends who believe in the teachings of Jesus and believe in Jesus Christ as presented in sacred scripture. And they do all of the following all the time. I have friends from Stanford who pursued PhDs in all sorts of different things, biology and chemistry and physics and, just lots of different fields, all the while believing in the teachings of Jesus. And so one of the slides actually that chemist back at University of Michigan at the Veritas Forum showed that I thought was interesting was similar to this. And it just showed that many famous scientists in history, they did science, and worshipped Jesus. So Copernicus, Sir Francis Bacon, Kepler, Galileo, just many famous scientists throughout history, Faraday, they were doing science brilliantly, laying a foundation for science that we still use today. At the same time, worshiping Jesus. Was their theology perfect? So there are some issues there. Not everybody maybe has the same theology as you or me, but in general, they did science and they worshiped Jesus. And that was very interesting to me back in my college days when I realized that really the foundation of much of the science that we still use today was discovered by people who believed in and worshipped Jesus. And to add to that, many famous scientists of today do science and worship Jesus. It's still happening today. Here are just a few. I added this slide today, and so I'm going to add more to the list. But here's just a few examples of very well-known, very well-respected scientists of our day who are Christians. So Dr. James Tour, professor at Rice, he's a synthetic organic chemist, one of the world's most cited researchers, and a signer of the scientific descent from Darwinism also. And there's an interesting talk. If you want to take a picture of this slide, you can, or watch this later, you can get the YouTube of an interesting talk that he gives. Dr. John Lennox, a famous mathematician, emeritus professor at Oxford, and he actually has a new movie called Against the Tide that is relatively new, that's kind of about this whole tension between science and Christianity. So I haven't watched it yet, but I am interested in watching that. Dr. Henry Fritz Schaefer, he's a computational and theoretical chemist. He was a professor at Berkeley for 18 years and then University of Georgia. He's one of the most highly cited chemists in the world. And he is actually the one that I saw at the Veritas Forum at University of Michigan so many years ago. And there are many others. So like I said, I just made this slide today, but many, many others. Like I said, friends of mine who've gone on to be very well respected in their scientific fields who are Christians. So I think what we're getting at here is that in most areas of science, we actually have no conflict. Christians can and do pursue knowledge, recognize problems, formulate hypotheses, perform experiments, collect data. And science primarily deals with investigating mechanisms of the living and physical world. That's the purpose of science, really. And so the majority of the time, there is no conflict between science and Christianity. So some have coined the term operational science, a little bit of a controversial term in some circles, just to be aware of that. But some have coined that term as the aspect of science that relates to repeatable, verifiable, testable results. They're experiments we can do today in the lab, things that you can discover, that you can build a strong case. It doesn't deal with trying to interpret history or previous times. It's something you can do right here, right now, repeatable, publishable in a paper, and then somebody else can read that paper and they can perform that experiment and get the results, right then and there. And so some people call that operational science, and there really is no real huge conflict between science and Christianity and operational science, other than, I would say, in the area of ethics and in bioethics. And if you're interested in that topic, you can email us and I can get you some resources in that topic. But most areas of operational science, not a big problem. Gravity's gravity, whether you believe in Jesus or not. Chemicals in test tubes, they do certain chemical reactions, whether you believe in Jesus or not. You can plate bacteria, you can sequence DNA, you can do all these things, believing in Jesus, not a big deal. However, there's still an area of science where there is quite a conflict, and there has been, and there continues to be. And that's the theory of evolution, which does permeate our culture. And so you may actually feel like it's more of a conflict than actually it is in terms of science and Christianity. So what's the true source of conflict? Like I said, that really gets to this whole area of evolution. And as I mentioned, it's a relatively small part of science in actuality, especially a very small part of operational science, and arguably even a small part of biology. And that's a whole other topic. I could make that argument in a whole talk. But other than evolutionary biology, I would say evolution is even arguably a small part of biology. Yet many in our culture vehemently attack anyone who challenges Darwinian evolution. It's very interesting. It's quite a tension that we can experience, whether it's in the classroom or in our culture. So at its core, evolution asserts that life arose randomly. And so Christianity, on the other hand, asserts that life was designed with a purpose. And so here we do have a problem. And I'm going to say that again because it's so important. So at its core, evolution asserts that life arose randomly. Okay, randomly is there is no plan. It's just completely random by chance. Christianity, on the other hand, asserts that life was designed with a purpose. And so here we do have a problem. There's a tension. Those can't be true at the same time. That gets into a whole discussion of logic. You can't have random and purposeful at the same time. They contradict each other. And I want to pause here because I just want to acknowledge that this is not going to be interesting to everybody. This talk is going to be kind of bland for many of you because you're not really interested in this topic. And I get that. I totally get that. And for some of you, you might be really intrigued, like, wow, I want to dig deeper. And this is really cool. And I want to look into this more. Both are okay. But I want to say that I think this topic is best tackled in different levels. At some level, I think even if this topic is not interesting to you, it's important to acknowledge this point. So if you're in a conversation with someone who's talking about issues about evolution, about creation, about, do we have a purpose? Do we not? I think it's really important to say, well, at the very basic level, Christians feel that we have a purpose. We feel like we were designed, that each one of us, Psalm 139, that we were knit together in our mother's wombs. There is an incredible hope that's associated with that premise. And so it is very different than saying that life is totally random and without purpose. So I think it's important to understand that. If nothing else from this talk, I think it's important to understand that at its core, the real source of conflict is between chance and purpose. So let's continue and just talk about a few definitions first, so we're all on the same page. So evolution versus design versus creation. Again, these are very simplistic definitions, but I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of some of these definitions. Simplistic definitions, but important to get the gist of what I'm talking about. So biological evolution, basically, as I pointed out, says that life arose randomly. That's a key part of the whole theory. So that it's random, and it began as a single organism. That life arose through mutation and natural selection of that organism that evolved through transitional species into humans. And so that's the gist of the biological evolution process. You take one step different from that, and I don't have it defined here, but I want to make you aware that there is something called theistic evolution, which would be God guiding that process. But again, that does go against the very definition of evolution, which is that it's a random process and that it's not overseen by anything completely random. And so there's some tension there. I'm not going to get into that in this talk, but if it's a topic that you're interested in, you should be aware of that term. Next is the term design. So design is not necessarily a term that is a Christian term per se. There are actually people who are not Christians who are proponents of intelligent design, as it's sometimes called. And so it's good to be aware that it's not just a Christian thing or a Judeo-Christian thing, that there are agnostics who believe in the design approach. And what design says is that the complexity of life systems shows evidence of a designer. And so it's just simply saying that you see a car, there was a designer to that car, right? And so much of life appears to be designed that the simplest reason for that is that there was actually a designer. Then biblical creation then also acknowledges that there's a design, because of course there's a creator, but biblical creation says that God's the creator of everything, including all life forms. And so that brings up the biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation, that there's a narrative there, and that creation is part of that narrative, that God's the creator of everything, heavens and the earth, all life forms. So it's important to understand that at the heart of the debate are these opposing views, with biological evolution on the one side and then a design or a creator on the other side. And many have asserted that Darwin's theory of evolution fully explains the complexity of living things. So we need to understand that it's meant to be a full and complete narrative for life. And that there's been it's interesting that has not been very much room in the public arena to entertain any flaws in the theory of evolution, because it really is meant to be a full and complete narrative of life. And it's very threatening to challenge that narrative in many circles. One professor at Harvard puts it this way. He's an evolutionary biologist, but he says, we can't let a divine foot in the door. He says, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And remember, materialism, as some of you have studied, is, material world, it's all there is. So from a materialistic worldview of materialism, I have no spirit. There's nothing supernatural, beyond the natural world. It's a very naturalistic type of understanding of the world, that I am only the matter that makes me. I am my brain. There is no soul. It is a worldview void of spirituality of any sort, whether it's Christianity or New Age spirituality or any of the other worldviews that are out there. Materialism would not acknowledge any spiritual dimension. There's no room for it. And so it's interesting that a lot of evolutionary biologists are very passionate about this subject, about not letting a divine foot in the door. So another quote from the same professor: "Evolution is fact, not theory. Birds arose from non-birds and humans from non-humans. No person who pretends to have any understanding of the natural world can deny these facts any more than he or she can deny that the earth is round, rotates on its axis, and revolves around the sun." So as we see in some of these quotes, that evolution really is more than mere science within our culture. It's promoted by its practitioners. This is a quote from Michael Roos in his article, Saving Darwinism from the Darwinians, from the National Post. He said this: "Evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity, with meaning and morality. Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it's true of evolution still today." And I think, isn't that so true, that it really is more of a secular religion in our culture? And kind of a side note, it's kind of interesting that if you look at Supreme Court cases, that the Supreme Court actually does define secular humanism as a religion. And so that's why you have different Supreme Court cases that have upheld the ability of students, especially, to express their faith within schools, because the Supreme Court has said that if you don't let that expression occur, then you basically have a different religion, a religion of secular humanism, take over. And so Michael Roos, although he is pro-evolution and is not really arguing against evolution, he is saying that let's acknowledge this to be a religion. So let's understand a little bit more about this evolution debate. And we're just scratching the surface here, but we're going to dig into a couple of issues here that I think show why it's important to understand this topic a little bit further. So the key controversy is that problems with evolutionary theory are really not allowed really in our culture. Flaws, gaps in Darwin's theory of evolution are rarely hinted at in schools, museums, books, media. And the focus of this talk is, we're going to specifically talk about origin of life issues and the creation of the first organism, the progenote theory, which is now more commonly called LUCA, or last universal cellular ancestor. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. And so I'm going to call this the progenote theory because this is how I learned about this topic when I was in grad school, and I'm just more familiar with that language. And so we're going to dig into one issue that is really not addressed properly in the theory of evolution. And so the purpose of me going into this detail, which may or may not be interesting to you, is really just to show you that there really are gaps in this theory of evolution, and that it's okay to question that, and it's okay to dig into this further. And yet in our culture, how interesting that that's so taboo. So let's start with problems with the progenote theory. So what is the progenote according to evolutionary theory? So it's the first living organism. So that's a simplification somewhat for the purpose of this talk. But you can just think of it as the first living organism. There could have been it's a little, according to the theory, they have all these different ways of describing that, multiple organisms, but you can think of it as just the first living organism. And it would be a single cell, similar to a bacteria. And the important thing, according to this theory, is that it's a common ancestor to all living creatures. So let's take a closer look at that. The story of the origin of life, according to evolution, goes something like this. You start out with a prebiotic suit, all sorts of chemicals make up the prebiotic soup. And then out of that prebiotic soup come organic molecules, the foundational molecules of life. And then those molecules kind of assemble and, get together, and they're not living yet. But the way the story goes is that they would then assemble and create this living organism, this single-celled living organism. So then the second part of the story goes like this. You have the progenote, and so you have your single-celled organism, and then that organism, through mutation and natural selection, goes through, over lots of time, transitional species, and then ultimately to humans. And so one of the greatest problems with evolution is actually the very beginning of the story. And that's really all we have time to address for tonight. But the problem is with the very beginning, how do we get from non-life to life? That's a huge jump, a massive jump that's kind of just skipped in a lot of textbooks. And it's important to understand that even before you get to the organism, that the soup itself is even in question. So all that chemistry it's not like we were there, and so we have to rely on scientists to describe that soup for us. And the way it's described in textbooks is frequently that it's just a done deal, that we know everything about it. But Michael Denton, who's actually an agnostic last time I checked, but he wrote an interesting book, and he said this: considering the way the prebiotic soup is referred to in so many discussions of the origin of life as an already established reality, it comes as something of a shock to realize there's absolutely no positive evidence for its existence. So, even the soup itself is in question. Then it gets really interesting when you then look at that soup, all of a sudden assembling these really complicated molecules, the biological molecules. So remember, this next step in the story is the prebiotic soup. Then all of a sudden these organic molecules kind of just form before you can even get to a single-celled organism, the progenote, or LUCA. Sir Frederick Hoyle, who again is not a Christian, but he's a British astronomer and mathematician, he set out to calculate the mathematical probability of the spontaneous origin of life from a prebiotic soup environment. So starting with a hypothetical primordial soup, Hoyle calculated the probability of just the spontaneous generation of just the proteins of a single amoeba. And he went on to say this: the likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 zeros, essentially, after it. It's enough to bury Darwin in the whole theory of evolution. So he also went on to say this, which was kind of an interesting quote: the notion that not only the biopolymer, but the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial organic soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a higher order. So he's got a very British sense of humor, you can see here. He also made another comparison that I wanted to read. He said the chance of obtaining even a single functioning protein by chance combination of amino acids, he compared it to a solar system full of blind men solving Rubik's Cube simultaneously. So it's incredibly complicated. And not only are the actual biopolymers incredibly complicated, but there is a whole process that is happening within the cell that's extremely complicated. Even though it might seem simple, a bacteria is incredibly complex. And when I had to teach in grad school, I had to teach a class. I was a teaching assistant to get funding for part of my grad school. I had to teach microbiology. And so the textbook that I used had this quote. I just dug it out and figured out, hey, how did they describe this process? Does it sound really certain? And this is what I found. Brock Biology of Microorganisms said this: what was the first self-replicating organism like? this question is impossible to answer. And the explanation, I didn't put the whole thing here, but it was full of may have, would have, could have. And the truth is that scientists do not know exactly how a living cell could have arisen from the prebiotic soup, because it's so incredibly complicated going from non-life to life. They have theories and they have a lot of, what if this or what if that, but it is not a certain fact how that came to be. And so my point in all of this, and again, realizing that not every one of you is going to be really fascinated by science like I am, big picture here is jumping from molecules to life is a big jump, a huge jump. So you have cells reproducing, and the DNA needs to be replicated. Then there's a process of transcription where you're making RNA from DNA, and translation. Ribosomes decode the RNA to make amino acid chains that turn into proteins, and numerous proteins are required to produce DNA, yet DNA is necessary to produce proteins. So which came first? So cells have to create energy. Numerous enzymes are involved with this, and it's an incredibly complicated process. And so it's really important, big picture, to just understand that this is no small feat, jumping from non-life to life. It's a massive jump. And Sir Frederick Hoyle, our friend, the British astronomer and mathematician, said this: the probability of the spontaneous generation of a single bacterium, just one, is about the same as the probability that a tornado swept through a junkyard and could assemble a 747 from the contents therein. So I'm going to say that one more time. The probability of the spontaneous generation of a single bacterium is about the same as the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard could assemble a 747 from the contents therein. Incredibly complicated. So just to pause here for a second, I want you to think about what is the definition of life? So what makes an organism alive? So just a few of the things that are needed are the ability to reproduce, to use energy, to respond to stimuli. I want you to take a moment and just feel your pulse, and understand that in that pulse there is a whole, thousands of chemical reactions happening just to make your heart beat. And then you take a look at something like your shoe, or a desk, or just a glass, something like that, and just reflect on the difference between that pulse and something like your shoe, and what a massive jump that is, jumping from non-living to life. So big picture here is that non-life to life is a part of the evolution story that is not explained well. Jonathan Wells, Ph.D. in molecular and cell biology, said this: the problem of assembling the right parts in the right way, at the right time, at the right place, while keeping out the wrong material is simply insurmountable. Frankly, the idea that we are on the verge of explaining the origin of life naturalistically is just silly. So, and we're just talking about trying to get to one cell, let alone something as complex as a bacterial flagella, for example, or the human eye, for example. Incredibly complex structures, and incredibly difficult to create the narrative of jumping from non-life to life in this way. In fact, Francis Crick, who shared the Nobel Prize for discovering the molecular structure of DNA, and most certainly does believe in random, evolution, but he did say this: an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. So almost a miracle, yet he can't acknowledge that miracles do take place, and he doesn't believe in miracles. But this is the kind of language that so many scientists use: almost a miracle. They use as if there were a God, so many times in the writing, because they just can't put it all together. And so another quote from George Wald says this, that we're kind of left with nothing with that view. Most modern biologists, having reviewed to satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, are left with nothing. And so I want to just say again that this is a topic that, for some of you are like, what are you talking about? What are all these terms? It might seem confusing. And if that's where you're at, I totally get it. Just take a step back and think about those two things. Think about the whole issue of, are we just material bodies? Is that all we are? Versus, do you believe in a soul, a spiritual aspect of life? Big picture things about why we care. Is life just random, or is there a purpose? And that's really what this talk and what this topic is getting at in the big picture. And so there are reasons why we should care about this topic, even if you don't necessarily want to be one of those people who really digs a lot deeper. There are a lot of reasons to at least have a basic understanding of a lot of these issues. First of all, so why should we care about this, about understanding the conflict? First of all, this area has been used to attack the fundamental Christian tenet that God is the designer of life. That's a basic part of a Christian worldview, is that God is the designer, that he created us, that he loves us. And many evolutionists, their hostility has really impacted the culture to the point where a lot of Christians will feel shamed in different classes and universities. And I do think it's important for us to care about that and how we can respond. This area has also increased doubt among Christians, and when they go off to different classrooms or colleges or out in life, when they don't have an understanding of these topics, they're very easily swayed. And I've encountered that many times in conversations of people who just kind of flutter off into away from their faith by arguments that actually aren't that strong when you understand this topic. So I think it's good to dig a little bit deeper, even if this isn't your thing, so to speak. And also, evolution has prevented non-Christians from fairly evaluating the Christian faith within our culture. And so there are a lot of reasons why we should care about this. Atheist and leading spokesperson on evolution, Richard Dawkins, he said this quite a while ago, but boy, he has some quotes that are he's really a piece of work. They're very hostile towards Christians and the Christian worldview. So he said this: "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." So trying to be nice there, right? So ignorant, stupid, insane. So these are all words that he uses to attack those who wouldn't believe in the random process of evolution. So this also impacts the next generation. That's another reason why I do care about this topic so much. Look at some of these quotes from this textbook, Evolutionary Biology. "Evolution, it's not a theory, it's a fact, as fully as the fact of the Earth's revolution around the sun. Like the heliocentric solar system, evolution began as a hypothesis and achieved facthood as the evidence in its favor became so strong that no knowledgeable and unbiased person could deny its reality." And isn't that interesting? Because we just looked at one chapter of the evolution theory, which was the very beginning chapter, which really lays the groundwork for the whole thing, which is origin of life issues. And we found that there were actually a lot of gaps in that, weren't there? So many gaps in that, not fully explained whatsoever. And yet he says this is a fact. Well, how do you know that it's a fact? It's a fact because we can't let a divine foot in the door, like we talked about before. And then he says in the textbook also, by coupling undirected purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of life processes superfluous, meaning unnecessary. And so, any kind of spiritual explanation of life, according to this textbook, is unneeded. All you need is a story of evolution, and that's it. And that's why a lot of people do call it a religion. So how do we respond to this area that can be so uncomfortable, and they're difficult topics as well. So how can we respond? And I would say this: I think it's really important to dig into the issues at your level. I think that as we talked about, there are some people who, they're just not that interested. And so I would say it's important to get a basic understanding of these topics so that you can defend your faith when you go off into the world, if you are part of the younger generation, or if you're an adult, so you can engage culture. I do think it's important to understand these issues. And I think it's important to be able to dialogue about these issues. You want to do it with respect and with gentleness, but to be able to dialogue at some level. And it's really important to find other people to join you. I really like apologetics. I like this stuff. I like science. And even for me, it's really hard at the end of a long day to, curl up with a good apologetics book. I mean, that's not exactly what I feel like doing when I'm exhausted. And so it's really important to find other people to join you. Many of you who are on this talk are part of the Worldview class that we're doing right now. And that's a perfect example of trying to be motivated by studying a topic with other people and alongside other people, and asking questions, and being able to share your thoughts about things. It's a lot easier to motivate. And maybe you just deal with this in some area that maybe you dig into that whole idea of a soul. J.P. Moreland wrote a book called, I can't remember the exact title, but it has soul in the title if you want to look it up on Amazon. And it's kind of making a case for the soul. Like, are we just, a bunch of chemical reactions in the brain, or do we have a soul? Maybe that is interesting to you. Or maybe you want to read a book that's more sciencey, and digging into those issues with some people in a youth group or something. But the important thing is to find some other people to do it along with you. Secondly, don't be intimidated by the arrogance that you can sometimes find within the scientific community. Like I said, I went through engineering undergrad, and then went on to do environmental microbiology at Stanford for grad school. And I've been around a lot of scientists. I still work with scientists for my job. There's some great friends that I have who are scientists. I love scientists. But sometimes you do find within that community this kind of arrogance there. And I love the story that kind of displays some of the arrogance that you can sometimes find. There was a famous scientist. He was the U.S. biochemist who had a patient in the 1980s who died of mad cow disease. His name was Stanley Prusner. Not exactly how you pronounce that, but he championed the idea that the disease-causing agent that caused mad cow was actually an infectious protein, which he started calling a prion. And he was actually ridiculed by the scientific world. His ideas were kind of heretical because at that time in the 80s, the only viruses and bacteria were considered infectious. Those were the only infectious agents that people would acknowledge. And his whole idea that proteins, that there could be an infectious protein, was totally heretical, totally crazy. People made fun of him. They were kind of ruthless, actually, in some of the articles that I read. And the scientific consensus was that he was wrong at that time. Well, they come to find out after years of his research that he, in fact, was correct. And this was a protein issue. And he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1997. So scientists change their minds. They're fickle. The community is fickle. They will dig their heels in and say, no, this is definitely the way it is. And then it does change over time. We've seen that with many issues within the history of science. So important to understand that scientists are just people. They may sound intimidating, but it's okay to question. In fact, questioning is supposed to be part of science. That's the ironic thing about some of these topics, is that you're meant to question, and science is meant to be able to go back and forth and to debate issues. And it's sad when that gets kind of discouraged in our culture. Stephen Meyer said this. He has a Ph.D. from Cambridge, and he's the author of numerous books and articles. And he said this: I look at the stars in the night sky, or reflect on the structure and information-bearing properties of the DNA molecule, and these are occasions for me to worship the Creator who brought them into existence. I believe He has caused them to be unveiled in His providence, and that He delights when we discover His fingerprints in the vastness of the universe and the complexity of the cell. So, in summary, in most areas of science, we made a case that there's really no conflict between science and Christianity. However, many in our culture have promoted the idea that you can't be a scientist and a Christian. And this is false. It's important to understand that that is false, and there are harmful consequences to this idea. The main source of conflict deals with evolution versus a design or creation worldview. And that is indeed a source of conflict. And there are serious problems with the theory of evolution that make questioning its validity reasonable. So I would encourage you to dig into these issues that at your interest level. Though not the emphasis of this talk, if you are interested in this topic, it's worth looking into the main arguments for God, moral, cosmological, teleological. You can see our Standing Firm seminar from Prepare the Way, or there's also a good series, True You, that gets into these issues, also the Truth Project. I would also encourage you to look into fine-tuning argument for God, or the topic of how information could evolve. That's also another interesting one if you want to dig further into this. Also, feel free to email us and we can give you other resources to look into. And again, if you do have questions, feel free to type them in the YouTube question area, and we can address them in future classes. And this is just Romans 1:20. For this, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Romans 1:20. So help us get the word out. Prepare the Way empowers and equips Christians to engage a secular culture and uphold a biblical worldview. There are a variety of seminars and presentations that Stephen mostly gives: Standing Firm Apologetics series, America at Crossroads, Navigating Public Schools, retreat and conference speaking, guest preaching. You can join our ministry email update list and let us know if you are interested in having us come and present at your church. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah. And you can check the subscribe button. That would be great on our webpage. You can also download. We have a lot of free resources at preparetheway.us, preparetheway.United States. And on this link right below in the description, there's a link for a document, The Religion of Darwinian Evolution. It has several of the quotes that Sarah used. Anyways, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for being with us.